welcome to the first recorded lecture for online life science. So this lecture is going to look at properties and diversities of life. Life, or the study of life, I should say, is called biology, which comes from the word bio, which is a Greek word that means life. For example, a biography is writing about somebody's life. So biology is the study of life. Okay. That kind of begs the question then, what does it mean for something to be considered alive? What does it mean to be a living organism? And for many species, it's very easy for us to see that they're living organisms. For example, penguins. I like penguins. Penguins clearly are alive. Nobody's going to dispute that. But what about this? This is Staphylococcus bacteria. Are they a living thing in the same way that our penguins are alive? The answer would be yes, they are. So what do these two have in common that makes them living organisms? Well, it's hard to come up with a single definition, and I think a better way of defining life is talking about the features that organisms have to have in order to be considered alive. And so we've got 7 of them listed here. Living things are built from cells. They respond to stimuli. They reproduce. Over time, their populations change due to natural selection and evolution. They grow and develop. They maintain a consistent environment within their body called homeostasis. And living things use and process energy. All of those characteristics would clearly apply to our penguins here, but they equally apply to the smallest of bacteria. Let's take a look at some of those properties in a little bit more detail. So the first property of life is that living things are composed of cells, and these cells create an orderly appearance or produce order within living things. The definition of the cell is the fundamental unit of life, or the building block of life. So all living things are built from either one cell, as would be the case for our bacteria that we looked at there, or living things can be built from many cells, which is what you are. Organisms that are just one cell are called unicellular, and organisms that are built from many cells, in your case, trillions of them, you would be an example of a multicellular organism. Right? All animals and plants are multicellular. Bacteria and some other lesser-known organisms would be unicellular. One cell is the entire organism. These pictures here, or I should say this top picture here, shows the cells of an onion. So this is looking at a single layer of tissue from an onion. And you can see each of these compartments that I'm kind of circling here. Those are individual cells. Plants have what are called cell walls, which makes their cells look very, very orderly and easy to define under a microscope. And so you can clearly see that with the onion there. Sticking with the theme of plants, we've got a couple of sunflowers here. So I believe the sunflower name comes from the bright yellow flowers that you see, because it does look a bit like the sun, right? But also, sunflowers could receive that name for their ability to orient their leaves toward the sun to maximize sun exposure. So, me, for instance, I want to minimize sun exposure because I get sunburned really bad, but I can't do what plants can do, which is photosynthesis. They can use the sunlight to ultimately convert carbon dioxide into their food. So if you're harnessing sunlight to make food, you want to get as much as you possibly can. And so what sunflowers will do is they'll orient their leaves, because the green part is what actually does the photosynthesis. The pretty flowers don't do that. The green parts do, the leaves do, and so they will orient their leaves toward the sun to maximize sun exposure. The plant is responding to a stimulus. It's not moving like an animal would do, but it's responding to a stimulus, which is another feature that we see in all living things. Animals, as you know, are capable of movement or nearly full movement. Plants, like the sunflower mentioned, can turn to face sunlight. Another example of plants responding to stimuli would be closing their flower petals if it's rainy and there's no sunlight, and then opening them up when the sun comes out to attract pollinators. But even single-celled organisms like bacteria will have different responses to light and chemicals and whatever else might be around them at any given time. So living things respond to stimuli, they're built from cells, and then reproduction. All living things reproduce. So how does that work? Well, a living thing has what's called deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, and there's a lot of detail we could go into here, but we're not going to do that now. The short summary of it is that DNA is a certain type of biological language that directs an organism to be built a certain way. And so you and I, in our cells, we have the blueprint, the DNA for building us. And we look the way that we do because of the specifics of the language in our DNA that determines how we got built. So, living things will pass on their particular DNA to the next generation, and that's going to be reproduction. There's two principal strategies here. One strategy is called asexual reproduction, and the other one is sexual reproduction. They differ in a couple ways. First of all, they differ in the number of parental organisms needed to happen. With asexual reproduction, there's just one parent involved. And this picture down here shows a bacterium in the process of asexual reproduction. This was one, I guess it still technically is one, but it was one non-dividing bacterial cell, and you'll notice that it's in the process of splitting, and it's going to become two new daughter cells. And so one parent is all you need for asexual reproduction. It's effectively cloning. Okay. If you use asexual reproduction, the offspring that are produced are going to be genetically, or in terms of their DNA, they'll be exactly the same as the parent that you started with. So humans can't do this at all, but it would be like taking some of your cells and then growing another you, identical to you in terms of your genes. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, uses two parental organisms, and each of those pass on half of their DNA. So the offspring then is a genetic mix of both the biological mother and the biological father, which means the offspring are unique in their DNA. Unless you have an identical twin, your DNA is not identical to anyone else on the planet. So, reproduction, responding to stimuli, cells. We've got the first three properties of life discussed there. Growth and development is another property of life. We're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but organisms grow and develop over time. Genes ultimately determine and guide that growth process. Homeostasis. This is definitely a word you're going to want to know. So homeostasis is regulation of an organism's body systems. So regulating the internal environment within an organism's body. What are some things that have to be kept within a certain range? Temperature is the most common example here. So your body temperature, around 98.5 degrees Fahrenheit or something close to that. If you get too hot or too cold, your organs cannot function and it can ultimately kill you if you're at that temperature for too long of a time. So temperature, pH has to do with how acidic an organism is. And so your body has to maintain a specific pH value in order for optimal functioning. The amount of salt in your body has to be kept within optimal range as well for your organs to properly function. All of these things have to be balanced. They have to be kept within a certain range in order for your body to function. Temperature regulation in particular is called thermoregulation, and it's a type of homeostasis. Take a look at the bird in the picture. If you live around St. Louis, I would really hope you know what that is. That is a cardinal. So cardinals are a type of bird, and birds are what's called endotherms. So endo means inside or within, and therm means temperature. So cardinals and other birds use their metabolism to generate heat to maintain homeostasis. And it's not just birds. You do this as well, because you're a mammal, and so do all other mammals. So mammals and birds are endotherms. The term you've probably heard for this is warm-blooded, and that means that when they break down food, the heat that's released from that process is used to warm up their bodies. And so this allows birds and mammals to survive in cold temperatures because they don't need an external source of heat to warm them up. They can warm themselves up internally. It's not pictured up there, but the alternative to being an endotherm would be an ectotherm. Ecto means outside, and so these guys are organisms that use external sources of heat for thermoregulating. This would be reptiles. You've seen turtles sunning on logs. You've seen lizards sunning on rocks, I'm sure. This is what they're doing. They can't do what you do. They can't generate enough heat using their metabolism, so they have to go and get heat from an external source. Generally in the wild, that would be the sun. Some species just match their surrounding temperature. A lot of fish do that. That's called poikilotherms, but don't worry about that one. So homeostasis, growth and development, energy processing. Okay. You use energy. Even sitting here watching this video, you're using energy, right? So energy is the ability to perform work. So I'm going to put that up here. Energy is the ability to perform work. And so all of the things that your cells are doing, that requires you to have a source of energy in order to do that. So where do you get that energy from? Well, you and I, like this deer here, we have to eat stuff. We have to consume other organisms in order to get our energy. Okay. The term for that is a heterotroph, which means other or another, and then feeding. So feeding on another organism. So if you go and eat a fruit, something like that, that came from a plant, that's another organism. If you eat chicken, the meat comes from the chicken, which in turn ate some type of grain or plant, which then was another organism. So no matter whether you eat meat or plant material or mushrooms or whatever it is you consume, you're eating some other organism that has energy. But where did your food get its energy from? If you're eating plants, your food gets its energy from the sun. So let me do a very poor drawing up here. The sun is providing us on Earth with a barrage of solar energy. You and I can't do anything with it, but plants can. And so what plants can do, that's a flower. What plants can do is they can use the sun's energy to take carbon dioxide, which is in the air, and they can convert that into sugars. So plants go out in the sun, use photosynthesis, that's what this is called, and they can convert CO2 into sugars using the sun's energy, right? You and I, we can then eat those sugars. We're heterotrophs, we have to feed on another. An autotroph means self-feeding, and autotrophs would be organisms like plants that can harness energy from the sun and make their own food. In this picture, the grass is an autotroph. The deer is a heterotroph. All plants are autotrophs for the most part. There's always weird exceptions to just about everything. And all animals and all fungi are heterotrophs. So mushrooms have to feed on other organisms too. They just feed on wood or particulate matter in the soil or whatever else they're growing on. So animals and fungi are heterotrophs. They have to consume other organisms for energy. Plants are autotrophs. Again, ultimately, the energy for just about everything can be traced back to our sun. And last but not least, seventh property of life is a big one. Living things experience natural selection, which causes evolution. Evolution is biological change over time. You hear that word used in non-scientific circles too, right? The evolution of music, the evolution of fashion, etc. And it means generally the same thing here. It's change over time. But it's very important to note that individual organisms themselves do not actually evolve. What evolves is a population. So let me go ahead and define that word for you. A population of living things is going to be all of the members of a particular species in a particular area. So I live in Rolla, so the population of Rolla is about 20,000. That is all of the people living in Rolla, right? So populations exist for all different species, and I don't think that the word species is defined up here, so I'm going to go ahead and put that one on the board as well. I know you've heard of this term, but you may not be familiar with how it's defined. A species is a group of organisms that regularly reproduce with each other and the key is they make offspring that are able to continue reproducing themselves. They're fertile. So that is the best biological definition of species. It's a tricky one sometimes because organisms populations are evolving, but this is the best definition of species. A group of organisms that reproduce and make fertile offspring. So, let's go back to this. Individual organisms do not evolve, populations do, so that's going to be a particular species, all of the individuals of that species living in an area. That group is going to change over time, even though no one individual organism is going to evolve. So here's how that works. In a population of organisms, some individuals have genes that are better suited for the environment than others. The well-suited individuals pass on more of their genes than the individuals who are less suited for that environment. And over time, that causes a shift in the genes of a population, and that is an example of evolution occurring in action. Specifically, let's take a look at the pepper moth example. So, pepper moths live in England. You can see on the top there, one moth. You can't see the dark morph of the moth, which is right here. You can see the light morph. Okay? So, there's two morphs of pepper moth that occur in England. If you look at this picture, you can see this moth camouflaged well here. It's camouflaged because of this fungal growth called a lichen. Right? And so lichens, they don't do well with pollution. And so before the Industrial Revolution in England, they grew quite extensively, which allowed the light-colored pepper moth to camouflage on them and survive and reproduce successfully. During the Industrial Revolution, pollution increased, the lichens couldn't grow as well as they had, and so the bark of the trees is darker, which favors the dark morph of the moth. And so pre-Industrial Revolution, lighter moths were more common. Natural selection at the time favored them because of the lichens. But then during the Industrial Revolution, lichens died, soot darkened the trees, natural selection favored the darker moths. Population of moths changed over time. Recently, they've cleaned up some of the pollution that is occurring, and so we're seeing a shift back potentially towards lighter moths being favored with the natural selection in the current environment. But point is, this is a good example of biological change over time affecting a population of one species. And yeah, it's a good example of evolution and natural selection in action. So just to clear up the difference between evolution and natural selection, evolution describes a population changing over time, but there are two ways that this can happen. And the first one we just talked about, which is natural selection. Natural selection is these three sentences. Organisms that are better suited pass on their genes to the next generation in greater numbers than organisms that are less suited. But here's the thing, natural selection determines which genes get passed on. It doesn't create new genes. In other words, natural selection can pick between A, B, and C, if those are three different versions of a gene, but it can't give us a new one, gene version D. It can only pick between the genes that are already there. It can only select what's already there. Evolution, though, does involve new genes showing up. That is mutation. So the two mechanisms that cause evolution are mutation and natural selection. Natural selection can only work with what's there. Mutation is when there's a change in the genes due to an error in the copying process. And so if there's an error in the process of making an egg or a sperm cell, then the offspring is going to have some new genes from their parents. An example in people of a mutation that was beneficial. The normal condition when it comes to digesting milk is that you can't do it. Lactose intolerance is normal. Many thousands of years ago, a mutation occurred where the enzyme, the digestive enzyme that you need to... Okay, let's get some background here first. To make this easier to understand. When you were a baby, you produced something called lactase. This is an enzyme that lets you break apart milk, sugar, lactose. Everyone makes lactase as a baby, but then the normal condition is that that gets turned off when you're weaned off of milk. And so, as an adult, you don't make that, you can't digest lactose sugar in milk. That's the normal condition. A mutation occurred in the distant past where the gene that coded for shutting off this lactase once you got weaned, that gene changed to where, now lactase just keeps getting made through your whole life, which takes a little bit of energy to make it, but it allows you to digest dairy products. That's beneficial. Especially with food insecurity being a lot worse in the distant past when this happened. And so people who had the mutation to keep producing this enzyme that let them digest milk and dairy, they would have survived during times when perhaps other food resources were not readily available, or they would have been healthier than people who couldn't consume dairy products. Either way, the ability to keep digesting milk into adulthood was a beneficial mutation. And so natural selection favored people who could do it. So that's why it's widespread nowadays, the ability to digest lactose, the ability to drink milk, came about as a mutation. That's what this is talking about. So mutations occur if they're beneficial, like this one was, drinking milk, then natural selection will favor the organism with that mutation. They'll reproduce a lot, and over time, you'll notice that mutation become more abundant thanks to natural selection. So they work in tandem together to cause evolution. So those are the 7 properties of living things. The second half, and I'm going to make sure that this phone is still recording. It is. Awesome. So, yeah, I'm very high tech here. I'm using my phone to record this. All right. Levels of biological organization. So, this is kind of a standalone slide that I want you to be aware of. When we're trying to understand the complexity that is life, one way to look at it is to look at it in terms of levels of organization. Starting simple, building up more complex, ultimately getting to the entirety of the planet Earth and all of its living things. So the simplest level of organization that we're going to look at is the atom. You've got protons, neutrons, subatomic stuff, but we're just going to start with the atom, which is a building block of matter. You've got different elements. So each atom is going to be an oxygen, a carbon, nitrogen, and so on and so forth. So you've got a building block of matter, which is an atom. They join together then to form molecules. For example, 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom would be a water molecule. And so now we've gotten more complex from a simpler level to a more complex level. Molecules then join together to form functional units within an individual cell. For example, within your cells, you've got the nucleus, the mitochondria, etc. And so molecules form these things called organelles, which will make more sense, I think, when we get into the cells chapter. Organelles make up a cell. Cells make up a tissue in your body. For example, your skin is a tissue that is built, well, your skin contains multiple tissues, but different cells work together to form tissues. Tissues form organs. Organs make an organ system. Organ systems make an organism, which is a living thing. Just be aware of these levels of organization. We're not going to go into much more detail than that with them. All right, here we go. So we've got the organism level of organization, an individual living thing. And all individual organisms of a particular species form a population, and this is going back to what we mentioned a couple slides ago. Remember, organisms are considered a species if they can reproduce with each other and make offspring that are fertile. Take a look at the top. You've got 2 bear species, the grizzly bear on the left, black bear on the right. They're closely related, clearly, because they're both bears, but they don't reproduce with each other on a regular basis, and they don't make fertile offspring. So they are 2 separate bear species. And so you've got a black bear population and a grizzly bear population. Those would be separate populations. Multiple populations of different species interacting together form a community. And I think this chart here is a good place to go then at this point. So this is an American buffalo, right? Used to be 60 million of them here in the US in the wild. One of them is an organism. A particular bison herd would be a population. One species, members of that particular species form the population. On the North American prairie, you would have a community that would include not only the buffalo, but also all of the grasses, prairie dogs, various species of snakes, there's a cool thing called a pronghorn, which is an American antelope that would have also lived on the plains. All of the flower species and insects that live there, all of the living organisms within that area would form the community. But the community is just living things. So if you're looking at a prairie community, you don't care about temperature or water or geology or rocks. Communities only concern living things. A biological community with all of its populations, along with non-living surroundings, form what's called an ecosystem. So the prairie ecosystem would take into consideration everything about that prairie, including temperature, water, soil, etc. Right? The community itself is just the life there. The ecosystem includes the life and the non-living stuff that impacts the life. Other ecosystems would include deserts, tundra, deciduous forest, which is what we have here in Missouri, in Rolla and Union. So those are ecosystems. When you take all the ecosystems of the planet together, you get what's called the biosphere. So that's all of the ecosystems of Earth taken together. So those last two slides were levels of biological organization. And again, just to reiterate, I'm just going to write them up here. Atoms built molecules, which built the organelles within the cells, which build the cells, which build up groups of cells called tissues, which make organs, organ systems, which make up an organism. Organisms together of the same species make up populations. Multiple populations make up communities. Communities make up ecosystems. All of them together make up the biosphere. That's the entirety of the biological organization hierarchy, so to speak. Let's go ahead then and take a look at this organism level. Remember, every single organism belongs to a particular species, a group of living things that reproduce with each other and produce fertile offspring. Classifying every species can be a challenge. So, all living species can first be placed in one of three what are called domains. So if you find a new species, let's say, and you want to classify it, the first thing you have to figure out is which of these three domains does it go into. The three domains listed over there are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Every single species goes into one of these. You're most familiar with eukarya, but let's start with the other two first. Bacteria, I know you've all heard of those. Features of bacteria. Number one, they're just one cell. They're unicellular. So look up here at this picture. This is a microscopic image of a bacterial species called Lactobacillus. This is a bacterium that lives in your gut. It's often put in yogurts to supplement gut health. It's actually mutualistic with you. It assists in your in healthy digestive system, and it gets nutrients from you. So it's a mutualistic relationship. But you'll notice it's just one cell. And if you were to look inside the cell, you would notice that there's no nucleus. So if you look at one of your cells, your DNA is kept within a protective double membrane in this organelle called a nucleus. That is how your cell is built. If you were to look at this lactobacillus, it has DNA, but you'll notice that protective nucleus, it's not there. So, the name for that, the name for being a cell with no nucleus, is prokaryote. If a cell is a prokaryotic cell, it means there's no nucleus there. And you'll run into that term relatively frequently as the semester continues. But bacteria, all of them, don't have a nucleus. So they are what's called a prokaryote. Archaea is the second domain. So all bacteria belong to the bacteria domain. And so if you've got a new species and you want to place it into one of these domains, you have to see, is it unicellular? Does it have a nucleus? If the answer is it's unicellular and doesn't have a nucleus, it could be bacteria. The other domain here that you probably aren't familiar with is archaea. So archaea are unicellular, just like bacteria, and they also are a prokaryote. They don't have a nucleus. The difference with archaea and bacteria is quite technical. We're not going to get into it. But archaea generally live in extreme places. The term for that is extremophile, and they tend to be found in places like vents on the deep sea floor, or geysers, or hot springs, places where you wouldn't think life should be. Archaea tends to be there. And then we have the third domain, which is what you're familiar with. Almost everything you think of as a living thing will be classified into this domain. Eukarya. So we talked about your cells. You have a nucleus. You are a eukaryote, a cell with a nucleus. And if an organism has eukaryotic cells, has cells with a nucleus, they go into this domain. You belong in the eukarya domain. This dragonfly belongs in that domain. Plants belong in this domain. Eukarya includes multicellular critters like the dragonfly or like yourself, and unicellular things. But the key here is that this domain has organisms with cells that have a nucleus. Every single organism is either a eukaryote or a prokaryote, and every species can be lumped into one of these three. And again, most things are eukarya. The last slide, then, is going to talk about something called binomial nomenclature. Bi means two. Nomial means naming. So if you look at every species has a scientific name. All right, you're familiar with common names most of the time, but every single species has a scientific name, which consists of two parts. That's why it's called binomial. The first part is the genus name. The genus name is always capitalized and comes first. The species name is always lowercase and comes second. Remember the definition of a species: a group of organisms that reproduce with each other and make fertile offspring. domestic cats have a scientific name of Felis catus. So, Felis would be the genus name, and there's about 4 or 5 other cat species in the world that have the genus name Felis as well. But Felis is the genus name, Catus is the species name. Together, they are the scientific name of our domestic cat. Right? So, Felis catus is an example of a scientific name. Humans are Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus. Sapiens is the species. Homo sapiens is the scientific name. We are all one species. Canis lupus is the domestic dog and the wolf. They're still treated as the same species. Canis is the genus. Lupus is the species. Every single species in the world has a scientific name that is built from these 2 parts, the genus name and the species name. The perk of using this system is that it allows communication across the language barrier for discussing species, and it also can avoid the confusion that using common names sometimes brings. So binomial nomenclature, it's a very good system when it comes to naming and describing different species. And that should do it for this first recorded lecture.